Hello everyone. Today we'll discuss about the ear part 2. In this video particularly discuss about the middle ear and the ear ossicle. Now first of all, the middle ear is also known as the tympanic cavity or the tympanum. The middle ear is actually a narrow air filled space situated in the petrous part of the temporal bone between the external and the internal ear. Now the middle ear is actually shaped like a cube. Its lateral and the medial walls are actually large, but the other walls are narrow, and the reason for this is that the cube is actually compressed from side to side. Its vertical and the anteroposterior diameters are both of about 15 mm. When seen in the coronal section, the cavity of the middle ear is biconcave. Okay, as the medial and the lateral walls are closest to each other as seen in this diagram. The distances separating them are 6 mm near the roof, 2 mm in the center and 4 mm near the floor. Now the parts of the middle ear. The cavity of the middle ear can be subdivided into the tympanic cavity proper, which is opposite to the tympanic membrane, and the epitympanic recess, which lies above the level of the tympanic membrane. Now the middle ear basically communicates anteriorly with the nasopharynx through the auditory tube and posteriorly with the mastoid antrum and mastoid air cells through the edictus to the mastoid antrum. The middle ear actually looks like a pistol in the sloping course of the edictus to the epitympanic recess and the auditory tube. The trigger of the pistol is actually the tympanic cavity. Outlet is auditory tube, handle is the edictus to mastoid antrum and mastoid air cells. The mucous membrane lining the middle ear cavity invests all the contents and forms several vascular folds which project into the cavity. This gives the cavity a honeycombed appearance. Now very important, boundaries of the tympanic cavity or the tympanum or the middle ear. Now it has basically, as you can see, roof, floor, anterior, posterior, medial and the lateral walls. Now over here, the roof is also known as a tegmental wall, and the roof basically separates the middle ear from the middle cranial fossa. Remember, the roof separates the middle ear from the middle cranial fossa. It is formed by a thin plate of bone known as a tegmen tympani. This plate is actually prolonged forwards as the roof of the canal for the tensor tympani. In young children, the roof presents a gap at the unossified petrosquamous suture where the middle ear is in direct contact with the meninges. In adults, the suture is ossified and transmits a vein from the middle ear to the superior petrosal sinus. Now next is the floor, or we can say jugular wall of the middle ear. The floor is formed by a thin plate of bone which separates the middle ear from the superior bulb of the internal jugular vein. This plate is actually a part of the temporal bone only. Now in the floor, near the medial wall, the floor presents the tympanic canaliculus which transmits the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve to the medial wall of the middle ear. Now next is the anterior or the carotid wall. The anterior wall is narrow due to the approximation of the medial and the lateral walls and because of the descent of the roof. The uppermost part of the anterior wall bears the opening of the canal for the tensor tympani. The middle part has the opening of the auditory tube. The inferior part of the wall is formed by a thin plate or thin plate of the bone which forms the posterior wall of the carotid canal. The plate separates the middle ear from the internal carotid artery. Now this plate of the bone is actually perforated by the superior and the inferior sympathetic keraticotympanic nerves. Remember, this plate is basically this plate of the bone is perforated by the superior and the inferior sympathetic keraticotympanic nerves and the tympanic branch of the internal carotid artery. The bony septum between the canals for the tensor tympani and for the auditory tube is continued posteriorly on the medial wall as a curved lamina known as the processus cochleariformis. Now its posterior end forms a pulley around which the tendon of the tensor tympani turns laterally to reach the upper part of the handle of the malleus. Now next is the posterior or the mastoid wall. Now the posterior wall presents the features from above to downwards as follows. First of all, superiorly, there is an opening of the edictus through which the epitympanic recess communicates with the mastoid or the tympanic antrum. The fossa incudis is a depression which lodges the short process of the incus. Means after the editors or the opening or the editors, there is fossa incudis, and this fossa incudis is actually a depression which lodges the short process of the incus. Now next is actually a conical projection known as the pyramid, which lies near the junction of the posterior and the medial walls. It has an opening at its apex for passage of the tendon of the stapedius muscle. Now next is at the lateral to the pyramid and near the posterior edge of the tympanic membrane is actually the posterior canaliculus for the chorda tympani, through which the nerve enters the middle ear cavity. Now next is the medial or the labyrinth wall. Now the medial or the labyrinth wall separates the middle ear from the internal ear. Now it represents some of the following features. Now first of all, it is the promontory. The promontory is actually a rounded bulging produced by the first turn of the cochlea. It is grooved by the tympanic plexus. Now next is the fenestra vestibuli. Now the fenestra vestibuli is an oval opening postero-superior to the promontory. It leads into the vestibule of the internal ear and is closed by the foot plate of the stapes. Now next is the fenestra cochleae. Now this fenestra cochleae is actually a round opening at the bottom of a depression postero-inferior to the promontory. Now it opens into the scala tympani of the cochlea and is closed by the secondary tympanic membrane. Now next is the prominence of the facial canal. Now the prominence of the facial canal actually runs backwards just above the fenestra vestibuli to reach the lower margin of the editors. Now the canal then basically descend behind the posterior wall to end at the stylomystoid foramen. Also the prominence of the lateral semicircular canal above the facial canal is present, and the sinus tympani is a depression behind the promontory opposite the ampulla of the posterior semicircular canal. Now next is the lateral or the membranous wall. Now this wall is basically not viewed from this view, so that's why the lateral wall of the middle ear is viewed from the medial side to have perfect view. Now the lateral or the membranous wall separates the middle ear from the external acoustic meatus, and it is basically formed by two parts, that is mainly by tympanic membrane along with the tympanic ring and sulcus, and partly by the squamous temporal bone in the region of the epitympanic recess. Now near the tympanic notch there are two small apertures, that is the pituotympanic fissure and the anterior canaliculus for the chorda tympani. Now first of all, pituotympanic fissure. Now this fissure lies in front of the upper end of the bony rim. It lodges the anterior process of the malleus and transmits the tympanic branch of the maxillary artery. Now next is the anterior canaliculus for the chorda tympani. Now for the chorda tympani nerve actually lies either in the fissure or just in front of it. Now the nerve leaves the middle ear through this canaliculus to emerge at the base of the skull. Now next is about the contents of the middle ear cavity. Now middle ear basically contains some few, as you can see in the diagram, 6 to 7 things. Now first of all, there are 3 small bones or ossicles, namely the malleus, incus and stapes. The upper half of the malleus and the greater part of the incus lie in the epitympanic recess. Now next are the joints between the ear ossicles. There are 2 muscles, namely the tensor tympani and the stapedius muscle, vessels supplying and draining the middle ear, the nerve, that is the chorda tympani and the tympanic plexus, and also of course the air. The next is the ear ossicles. Now we have basically 3 bones or 3 ear ossicles. There is the malleus, incus or the anvil, and the next is the stapes. Now first of all, the malleus. The malleus is so called because it resembles a hammer shape. Okay. It is the largest and the most laterally placed ossicle. Now the following parts of it are basically 5. That is first of all the rounded head. Now the rounded head lies in the epitympanic recess. It articulates posteriorly with the body of the incus. It provides attachment to the superior and the lateral ligaments. Now next part is the neck. The neck lies against the pars flaccida and is related medially to the chorda tympani nerve. Now next part is the anterior process. The anterior process is actually connected to the pituotympanic fissure by the anterior ligament, and the lateral process projects from the upper end of the handle and provides attachment to the malleolar folds. And the handle of this malleus extends downwards, backwards and medially and is attached to the upper half of the tympanic membrane. Now next is the incus or the anvil. Now this is so called because it resembles an anvil used by the blacksmiths, right? Now it resembles a molar tooth and has the following two parts, that is the body and the long process. The body is actually large and actually bears an articular surface that is basically directed forwards. It articulates with the head of the malleus. The large process projects downwards just behind and parallel with the handle of the malleus. Its tip bears a lentiform nodule directed medially which articulates with the head of the stapes. Now next bone is the stapes. Now this bone is so called because it is shaped like a stirrup and it is the smallest and the most medially placed ossicle of the ear. Now it has basically four parts. Now first of all, it has first of all small head. Now small head has a concave facet which articulates with the lentiform nodule of the incus. Now next is the narrow neck. Now the narrow neck provides insertion posteriorly to the thin tendon of the stapedius. It has two limbs or the crura, anterior and the posterior one. The anterior one is actually shorter and less curved and the posterior one is actually longer, which diverge from the neck and are attached to the foot plate. Now next is the foot plate, a foot piece or we can say base. It is basically oval in shape and fits into the fenestra vestibuli. Now very important, joints of the ossicles. Now the ossicle have basically two types of joint in them, that is the incudo-malleolar joint and the incudo-stapedial joint. The incudo-malleolar joint is actually several variety of synovial joint and the incudo-stapedial joint is actually ball and socket variety of synovial joint. Both of the joints are synovial joints only. They are surrounded by capsular ligament and accessory ligaments are three for the malleus and one each for the incus and the stapes which stabilizes the ossicles. All the ligaments are actually extremely elastic. Now next are the very important muscles of the middle ear. Now there are basically two muscles, the tensor tympani and the stapedius. Now both act simultaneously to damp down the intensity of the high-pitched sound waves and thus protects the internal ear. Now first of all the tensor tympani muscle, it basically lies in a bony canal that opens at its lateral end on the anterior wall of the middle ear and at the medial end on the base of the skull. The auditory tube lies just below this canal. The muscle arises from the walls of the canal in which it lies. Some fibers arises from the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube and some from the base of the skull. The muscle ends in a tendon which reaches the medial wall of the middle ear and bends sharply around the processus cochlear formis. It then passes laterally across the tympanic cavity to be inserted into the handle of the malleus. Now remember, tensor tympani is actually supplied by the mandibular nerve. The fibers pass through the nerve to the medial pterygoid and through the otic ganglion without any relay. Also, it develops from the mesoderm of first brachial arch. Now next, the stapedius muscle. Now this muscle lies in a bony canal that is basically related to the posterior wall of the middle ear. Posteriorly and below, this canal is actually continuous with the vertical wall of the canal for the facial nerve. Anteriorly, the canal opens on the summit of the pyramid. The muscle arises from the walls of this canal only. Its tendon emerges through the pyramid and passes forwards to be inserted into the posterior surface of the neck of the stapes. The stapedius is actually supplied by the facial nerve. It develops from the mesoderm of the second brachial arch. Now next is the arterial supply, the blood supply of the middle ear. The main artery of the middle ear are, first of all, the anterior tympanic branch of the maxillary artery which enters the middle ear through the pituotympanic fissure. Next is the posterior tympanic branch of the stylomastoid branch of the posterior auricular artery which enters through the stylomastoid foramen, petrosal and the superior tympanic branches of the middle meningeal artery. Next is the branches of the ascending pharyngeal artery and the tympanic branch of the internal carotid artery. Now the venous drainage over here is the veins from the middle ear drains into the superior petrosal sinus and the pterygoid plexus of the veins. Over here the lymphatic drainage actually passes to the preauricular and the retropharyngeal lymph nodes. Now over here the nerve supply. The nerve supply is actually derived from the tympanic plexus which lies over the promontory. The plexus actually formed mainly by the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve and the superior and the inferior corticotympanic nerves arising from the sympathetic plexus around the internal carotid artery. Now remember, the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve fibers are actually distributed to the mucous membrane of the middle ear, the auditory tube, the mastodentrum and the air cells. It also gives off the lesser petrosal nerve. Now what about the superior and the inferior corticotympanic nerves? Now this nerve actually arises from the sympathetic plexus around the internal carotid artery, and this fiber actually was vasomotor to the mucous membrane. Now next is about the masseter or tympanic antrum. Now the masseter or tympanic antrum is actually a small circular air-filled space situated in the posterior part of the petrous temporal bone. Now what is masseter air cells? Masseter air cells are actually a series of intercommunicating spaces of variable size present within the masseter process. Their number of actually varies considerably, and sometimes there are just a few and are confined to the upper part of the masseter process. Occasionally, they may extend beyond the masseter process into the squamous or the petrous part of the temporal bone. Now over here, the masseter antrum and the air cell are basically supplied by the posterior tympanic artery derived from the stylomasseter branch of the posterior auricular artery. The vein drains into the masseter emissary vein, the posterior auricular vein, and the sigmoid sinus. The lymphatics pass to the post auricular and the upper deep cervical lymph nodes, and the nerves are derived from the tympanic plexus formed by the glossopharyngeal nerve and from the meningeal branch of the mandibular nerve. Now the functions of the middle ear. Now it basically transmits the sound waves from the external ear to the internal ear through the chain of the ear ossicles, and thus transforms the airborne vibration from tympanic membrane to the liquid borne vibration in the internal ear. The intensity of the sound waves is increased 10 times by the ear ossicles. It is basically noted that the frequency of the sound does not change. Now very important, applied anatomy of the middle ear. Now fracture of the middle cranial fossa breaks the roof of the middle ear, ruptures the tympanic membrane, and thus causes bleeding through the ear along with the discharge of the CSF or the cerebrospinal fluid. Now also, throat infection commonly spread to the middle ear through the auditory tube and can cause otitis media. Now the pus from the middle ear may take one of the following course. Either it may be discharged into the external ear following the rupture of the tympanic membrane, or it may erode the roof and spread upwards, causing meningitis and brain abscess, or it may erode the floor and spread downwards, causing thrombosis of the sigmoid sinus and the internal jugular vein, or either it may spread backward, causing the masseter abscess. Now remember, the chronic otitis media and the masseter abscess are responsible for the persistent discharge of the pus through the ear. Otitis media is more common in the children than in the adults. Now next is the inflammation of the auditory tube, or we can say Eustachian catarrh, is often secondary to an attack of the common cold. Now this may cause pain in the ear, which is aggravated by swallowing due to blockage of the tube. Pain is relieved by the installation of the decongestant drops in the nose, which helps to open the ostium. Now next is the osteosclerosis. Now sometimes bony fusion takes place between the foot plate of the stapes and the margins of the fenestra vestibuli. Now this leads to deafness. The condition may be surgically corrected by putting a prosthesis. The masseter abscess is actually secondary to otitis media, and it is difficult to treat. So a proper drainage of the pus from the masseter requires an operation through the suprameatrial triangle. The facial nerve should not be injured during this operation. Now next is the infection from the masseter antrum and air cells can spread to any of the structure related to them, including the temporal lobe of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the sigmoid sinus. Also, the ear on infected side is actually displaced laterally and can be appreciated from the back. Now what is hyperacusis? Due to the paralysis of the stapedius muscle, movement of the stapes are actually damped, and so sounds get distorted and get too high in volume. This is known as the hyperacusis. So this was all about the middle ear. We'll discuss about the inner ear for the next video. So I hope you enjoyed well. Thank you so much.